The silence in this house used to be a comfort, a thick, warm blanket woven from a lifetime of shared memories with my late husband, Richard. It was a silence filled with the phantom echoes of his laughter, the creak of the floorboards where he used to pace while thinking, the distant lowing of the cattle he so adored. Now, the silence is a void. It is a cold, heavy thing that presses in on me from all sides, amplifying the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a clock that seems to be counting down the moments of my own obsolescence. My tea has gone cold in the china cup, the one with the tiny, hand-painted violets that Richard bought me for our 10th anniversary. My hands, wrinkled and spotted with the cartography of 72 years, are wrapped around it, but I can feel no warmth. I've been sitting here in this worn leather armchair, his armchair, ever since the phone call ended an hour ago. It wasn't a dramatic call, not in the way you see in films. There was no shouting, no climactic revelation. It was far more insidious than that. It was the sterile, clipped tone in my son Mark's voice, the forced patience as he spoke to me, as if I were a doddering child who couldn't grasp a simple concept. And then, the ultimate cruelty, a muffled sound before he hung up, a sound I have come to know with sickening familiarity, the light, dismissive titter of his wife, Amelia. That sound was the final punctuation mark on a sentence I had been refusing to read for years. A sentence that spelled out my slow, methodical erasure from my own life. This ranch, sprawling across 2,000 acres of Montana heartland, was never just property to me. It was the physical manifestation of a promise Richard and I made to each other on a cold winter's night in a cramped city apartment, our dreams far bigger than our bank account. He was a farm boy with calloused hands and a gentle heart. I was a bookkeeper who saw the world in ledgers and balanced accounts. Together, we bought this land with every penny we had and every dollar we could borrow. We built this life from the soil up. I remember the splinters in my fingers from helping him frame the first barn, the ache in my back from clearing rocks in the north pasture, the taste of dust and sweat and satisfaction. Every fence post holds a memory, every weathered plank on the porch tells a story. This house, which Amelia once described as tragically rustic, was built with our own 4 hands, a testament to a partnership that was as solid as the foundation stones we laid ourselves. When Richard passed 10 years ago, leaving me the sole custodian of our shared dream, I thought the hardest part of my life was over. I had no idea that the greatest betrayal was yet to come, and that it would come not from a stranger, but from the boy I had raised within these very walls. We had been prudent, Richard and I. We lived well within our means, reinvesting profits back into the land, into stocks, into a future we believed would be secure not just for us, but for our son and his children. I was what the banks call asset-rich. The land itself was worth a fortune, a fact that seemed to be of little interest to anyone until Amelia entered the picture. To me, its value was measured in sunrises over the eastern ridge, and the scent of alfalfa after a summer rain. To her, I would soon learn, its value was a number on a page, a resource to be plundered. And my son, my dear Mark, stood by and held the pickaxe. The phone call this morning was about their latest venture. They wanted to host an investors' weekend at the ranch. Just a few influential people, Mom, Mark had said, his voice slick with a kind of corporate cheerfulness he'd adopted from his wife. Amelia has it all arranged. It's to showcase the potential of the property. I knew what that meant. It meant Amelia's friends, in their crisp designer clothes, trampling through my vegetable garden, commenting on the charming antiquity of my kitchen, and looking at our life's work as a commodity. It meant I was expected to be the smiling, folksy proprietor, the living prop in their elaborate stage play of future wealth. I had simply said, Mark, I'm feeling a little tired. I'm not sure I'm up to hosting a large party. The pause was heavy. Then the strained patience. Mom, it's not a party. It's a strategic gathering. Amelia has worked very hard on this. We need this to go well. The unspoken words hung in the air. Don't ruin this for us. Then the whisper, the quick, sharp sound of Amelia's laughter in the background, as if my fatigue were the most amusing, most pathetic excuse she had ever heard. And in that moment, sitting in Richard's chair, I felt a deep, seismic shift inside me. The foundation of love and sacrifice upon which I had built my entire identity began to crack. Life with Richard was a study in quiet contentment. He was a man of few words, but deep currents. His love wasn't declared in flowery speeches. It was in the way he'd bring me a wild prairie crocus in the spring, the way he'd start my car for me on cold winter mornings, the way his eyes would find mine across a crowded room, a silent acknowledgement that we were a team. We were partners in the truest sense. He understood the land, and I understood the numbers that made living on it possible. I handled the books, the investments, the contracts with the grain suppliers. He handled the cattle, the fences, the fickle moods of the seasons. Our son, Mark, was born into this world of balanced partnership. He was a beautiful child, with Richard's dark hair and my blue eyes. We adored him. Perhaps, in hindsight, we adored him too much. We had known hardship, we wanted him to know only security. We had known scarcity, we wanted him to know abundance. He never had to worry about a failing crop, or a dip in the market. His world was insulated by our hard work. He had chores, of course, mending fences, feeding the stock, but for him, it was a chapter in his youth, not the whole story of his survival. Richard used to say, "I want him to have the choices we never did, Ellie," and so, Mark went to college, the first in our family. He studied business, of all things. We were so proud. He came back with a degree and a vocabulary we didn't always understand, talking about market trends, and capitalizing on assets. He seemed a little less comfortable in his old work boots, a little more at home in polished city shoes. Still, he was our son, and we saw his ambition as a modern version of our own. Then he brought Amelia home. She was from the city, a public relations consultant with a sleek blonde bob, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was polished, articulate, and looked at the ranch the way a collector looks at a rare artifact. She admired it, but she didn't understand it. She complimented my garden, but held her designer handbag away from the dirt. She called Richard sir with a deference that felt more like a strategy than genuine respect. I tried to like her, for Mark's sake. I hosted dinners, I asked about her work. I bit my tongue when she referred to our cherished home as a property. Mark was utterly captivated. He saw in her a sophistication he craved, a doorway into a world far removed from cattle auctions and harvest seasons. The shift was subtle at first. Mark started spending more weekends in the city than on the ranch. His talk of capitalizing on assets became more frequent, and I noticed the phrases were often ones Amelia had used. "Amelia thinks we are sitting on a gold mine, Mom," he'd say. "She says the location is perfect for development." Richard would just grunt and change the subject. He saw it, I think, long before I was willing to. He saw that Amelia wasn't just marrying our son, she was appraising our legacy. After Richard's passing, the subtlety vanished. I was grieving, vulnerable, and my instinct was to pull my son closer, to pour all my remaining love and resources into him and his new family. It was a mistake. My grief made me an easy target. The requests started small. "Mom, we're a little short for the down payment on the new car," Mark said one afternoon. "It's a safer model, for when the baby comes, the baby. My future grandchild. How could I say no to that?" I wrote a check for $10,000 without a second thought. It felt good to help, to provide. It felt like what a mother should do. The birth of my granddaughter, Lily, was a beacon of pure, uncomplicated joy in the fog of my grief. She was a perfect little thing, a tiny, exquisite fusion of all of us. Holding her for the first time, I felt a powerful, primal connection, a sense of continuity that the ranch itself had always given me. I saw in her a chance to pour out the love I still had for Richard, a new vessel for all my hopes. I resolved, in that moment, to do everything in my power to give this child the world. And so, the floodgates opened. Mark and Amelia announced they wanted to buy a condominium in a more exclusive part of the city. "The schools are better, Mom," Mark explained, a phrase that would become a common refrain. "It's an investment in Lily's future." The price tag was staggering, but the logic seemed sound. An investment in Lily. I sold a 50-acre parcel of land on the far western edge of the ranch, a piece of hayfield that Richard had always loved for the way it caught the evening light. It hurt, like cutting off a part of myself, but when I transferred the $200,000 to their account, the thank you from Mark was so effusive, so full of the warmth I had been missing, that I convinced myself it was worth it. For a while, it seemed to be. They visited more often, bringing Lily to see how Grandma Ellie. I would watch her take her first wobbly steps on the lawn where her father had learned to walk, and the ache of Richard's absence would soften just a little. I filled a trust fund for her education, ensuring she would never have to worry about tuition fees or student loans. I bought her clothes, toys, a pony that grazed in the paddock by the house. I was Grandma Ellie, the benevolent matriarch, and for a time, I was content in that role. I didn't see that I wasn't buying Lily's love, that was freely given, but I was paying for access to her. I was funding the lifestyle that allowed Mark and Amelia to see me as a useful, even vital, part of their lives. But the demands, cloaked as they were in the language of familial need, began to escalate. Amelia quit her job to become a full-time mother, a decision she announced as a great personal sacrifice. This, of course, meant their single income, Mark's salary from a mid-level management job, was stretched thin. The calls became more frequent. "Mom, the condo fees are higher than we expected. Mom, Amelia thinks we should join the country club." It's about making connections. For my career, each request was followed by the talismanic phrase, "It's for the future." For Lily, I paid for private school tuition, 4 summer camps in Europe, 4 designer clothes for Amelia, who insisted on maintaining a certain image for Mark's career. I sold another parcel of land, then another. I started dipping into the stock portfolio Richard and I had so carefully built. I felt a growing unease, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind that Richard would not have approved. He believed in helping your children, not enabling them. He believed in a hand up, not a perpetual handout. I was violating the core principles of our partnership, liquidating our shared dream piece by piece to fund a life of conspicuous consumption I didn't even understand. The ranch, my home, began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a bank vault. Amelia, in particular, started to treat it that way. During their visits, she would walk through the rooms with a critical eye, making suggestions. "You know, Ellie," she'd say, calling me by my first name in a way that felt more diminishing than familiar, "if you updated this kitchen, you could add tremendous value to the property." She wasn't talking about making it more comfortable for me, his mother, who cooked in it every day. She was talking about resale value. She spoke of my life's home, as if it were a house on a reality television show, waiting to be flipped. The pressure was constant, a low-grade hum of expectation. My no was never accepted as a final answer. It was treated as a temporary obstacle, a negotiation point. If I hesitated, I was met with sighs, with talk of their struggles, with implications that my frugality was selfishness. They made me feel that my simple, quiet life was somehow holding them back from their grand destiny. It was during this period of escalating unease that Frank started stopping by more often. Frank was our oldest friend, our neighbor from the adjacent ranch. He had been Richard's best man at our wedding and his staunchest friend through thick and thin. A widower himself, he was a quiet, observant man with eyes that saw more than most. He'd come over on the pretense of borrowing a tool or discussing a shared fence line, but I knew he was checking on me. He saw the strain in my face, the way my shoulders were perpetually tensed. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch drinking lemonade, he looked out over the fields and said, "Richard loved this view." He said it was the one thing that always made sense to him, no matter how crazy the world got, he looked at me then, his gaze direct and kind. "You look tired, Eleanor." Like the world's gotten a bit too crazy, I found myself confessing everything: the money, the pressure, the feeling of being slowly colonized in my own home. I told him about the country club fees and the European summer camps. I expected him to be shocked, but he just nodded slowly, a sad, knowing look on his face. "That Amelia," he said, shaking his head. "She's got a taste for things that other people have to pay for." He didn't criticize Mark. He was too loyal for that. But he validated my feelings. "Richard never meant for this place to be a burden on you, Ellie," he said, his voice firm. "He meant for it to be your fortress. Your home. Don't you ever let anyone make you feel like a guest in it." His words were a lifeline. They were the first external confirmation that I wasn't being selfish or unreasonable. I was being eroded. His friendship became my anchor in the swirling tide of my family's expectations. He reminded me of who I was before I became an endlessly renewable resource for my son and his wife. The first great turning point, the moment the hairline cracks in my foundation became gaping fissures, was their wedding. When Mark and Amelia announced their engagement, my heart swelled. My son was getting married. Of course, they wanted the ceremony to be at the ranch. "It's so meaningful, Mom," Mark had said. "So authentic," Amelia had chimed in. "The photos will be absolutely stunning. The rustic chic aesthetic is very in right now." I should have paid more attention to that phrase, rustic chic. It was a sign that my home was not to be a venue of love, but a backdrop. A carefully curated set piece. Blinded by motherly pride, I threw myself into the preparations. And, naturally, the financing. The cost of a modern wedding was astronomical, a fact Amelia lamented frequently. "We want it to be perfect, but we just don't have the capital," she'd sigh. So I paid. I paid for the enormous white marquee that covered half the main lawn. I paid for the caterers from the city, who charged a premium for the travel. I paid for thousands of dollars worth of flowers to be trucked in, because my own abundant roses and peonies were apparently not the right shade of blush. I paid for a string quartet and a valet service. I wrote check after check, telling myself this was my gift, my contribution to the most important day of their lives. I liquidated a significant portion of Richard's stock portfolio to cover the costs, a sum that would have allowed us to live comfortably for 5 years. The day of the wedding arrived, a perfect, sun-drenched Saturday in June. I wore my best dress, a simple but elegant navy blue silk, and the pearl necklace Richard had given me on our 25th anniversary. I felt a flutter of excitement, of pride. This was my home, my son, my day to shine as the mother of the groom. The reality was a slow, creeping humiliation. Amelia's family and friends, a flock of sleek, chattering city birds, descended on the ranch with an air of bemused condescension. They spoke loudly of the charming simplicity of it all. I tried to mingle, to be the gracious hostess, but I was met with blank stares or polite, dismissive smiles. They looked through me as if I were part of the scenery. A man in a linen suit asked me if I knew where he could find the bar. A woman in a formidable hat complained to me about the length of the grass, assuming I was on the catering staff. The wound that would fester for years, however, was inflicted by Amelia herself. I was standing near the back of the marquee, arranging a platter of cookies I had baked myself, when I overheard her talking to her bridesmaids. They were hidden from my view by a large floral arrangement. "Isn't Mark's mother just the sweetest thing?" one of them asked. And then I heard Amelia's voice, dripping with false affection that couldn't quite mask the contempt. "Oh, Ellie's a darling. A very sweet, simple country woman. She doesn't really understand our world, of course, but she means well. We just have to let her have her little projects, like her baking." A wave of cold shock washed over me. A sweet, simple country woman. A project. In that moment, I was no longer the matriarch of the family, the co-creator of the very ground she stood on. I was a quaint caricature, a folksy anecdote she could tell her sophisticated friends. I saw with sudden, brutal clarity that all my sacrifice, all the money I had poured out, hadn't bought me respect. It had bought them the right to patronize me in my own home. I wanted to leave, to flee, to hide myself in the quiet solitude of my bedroom. But I couldn't. I had to stay and watch my son marry this woman, a smile fixed on my face, while my heart felt like it had been trampled into the dust. The years that followed the wedding saw their ambition crystallize into a formal, terrifying plan. The vague talk of potential and assets finally took shape. They arrived one Sunday afternoon not for a family visit, but for a business meeting. They sat opposite me in my own living room, on the sofa I had bought with Richard 30 years ago, and spread a sheaf of glossy documents across the coffee table. It was a business proposal, complete with architectural renderings and financial projections. Their plan was to transform the ranch, my home. They wanted to convert the main house into a boutique hotel and restaurant. They wanted to build a dozen luxury cabins in the North Pasture. The old barn, the one Richard and I had built, was to become a high-end wedding and event space. They spoke with a breathless, manic energy, pointing at blueprints and spreadsheets. The demand for exclusive rural experiences is through the roof, Mom, Mark said, his eyes gleaming. We've already spoken to a top-tier hospitality group. They are interested, very interested. Amelia took over, her voice crisp and professional. The only obstacle, Ellie, is the financing. The banks require significant collateral, naturally. And since the property is entirely in your name, she let the sentence hang in the air. I stared at the architectural drawing of what was currently my living room. It had been redesigned as a reception lounge, with a sleek modern bar where Richard's bookshelf now stood. They weren't just planning to change the ranch, they were planning to erase us. They were planning to gut our life's work, and sell its hollowed-out shell to the highest bidder. The catch, the cold, hard point of the spear, was delivered by Mark. He cleared his throat, unable to meet my eyes. What we need, Mom, is for you to sign over the majority ownership of the property to us. A controlling interest. That way, we can secure the business loans we need to get started, he rushed on, as if saying the words quickly would lessen their impact. Of course, you'd be taken care of. We've planned for it. See? He pointed to a small square on the corner of the master plan, tucked away behind the area marked staff parking, and next to the stables. We are going to build you a brand new, state-of-the-art granny flat. All the modern conveniences. You'd be right here on the property, able to see everything, a granny flat. They were offering me a small box on the edge of my own life, a designated space where I could live out my remaining years as a spectator to the dismantling of my world. They wanted me to trade my home, my history, my identity, for a front-row seat to its destruction. I felt the air leave my lungs. The room seemed to tilt, the ticking of the clock growing louder and louder until it was a deafening roar in my ears. I looked at my son, at the man he had become, and for the first time, I felt a stranger was sitting across from me. He was not the boy who had chased fireflies in the yard, he was a corporate raider, and his target was his own mother's heart. I need to think about this, I managed to say, my voice a dry whisper. Amelia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, Ellie, she said smoothly. Take your time. Just not too much time. Opportunities like this don't last forever. They packed up their glossy proposal and left, leaving a profound and chilling silence in their wake. I sat there for hours, long after the sun had set, and for the first time since Richard died, I felt truly, utterly alone. I was no longer the custodian of a dream, I was the sole remaining obstacle to its liquidation. In the days that followed their business proposition, a heavy dread settled over me. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I walked the halls of my house feeling like a ghost. Every object I touched, every room I entered, seemed to mock me with memories of a life that was about to be bulldozed. I knew I couldn't agree to their plan. It would be a betrayal of everything Richard and I had stood for. But the thought of refusing, of facing their disappointment, their anger, their expertly wielded guilt, was terrifying. I was their mother. My entire life had been conditioned to meet their needs, to ensure their happiness. I decided I needed to speak to Mark alone, away from Amelia's cold, calculating presence. I needed to appeal to the son I had raised, the boy who still existed somewhere beneath the layers of ambition and greed. I called his cell phone one afternoon, my hand trembling slightly. "Mark, can we talk?" I asked. "Just you and me," he sounded harried, distracted. "Sure, Mom. What's up? Is it about the proposal? Have you made a decision?" "I just want to talk, son to mother," I said, my voice pleading. "Fine, fine," he said impatiently. "Hold on a second." The line went quiet, but not completely silent. I could hear muffled sounds, the clinking of a glass. And then I heard Amelia's voice, sharp and clear, not realizing I was on the line. "Is it her? What does she want now? Just get her to sign, Mark. Stop letting her drag this out. It's for the best. She's old, what does she need all that space for anyway?" A piece of ice formed in my chest. She's old. The words were a verdict, a dismissal of my entire existence. I was no longer a person with feelings, with a history, with a right to her own home. I was an inconvenience, an elderly problem to be managed. Before I could hang up, before I could process the sheer cruelty of it, Mark's voice came back on the line. And then he delivered the blow that would not just crack my foundation, but shatter it into dust. He must have thought he'd pressed the mute button. He must have thought he was speaking only to his wife. His voice was low, conspiratorial, and utterly damning. "Look," he said to Amelia, a weary sigh in his tone. "We just have to manage her for a little while longer. Be nice. Once the papers are signed, we can do what we want. If she becomes too much of a problem, we'll put her in that nice retirement village by the lake. Everyone says it's lovely." The world stopped. The air turned to glass and then splintered into a million sharp pieces. Manage her. Put her in a village. They were planning to dispose of me. I was a piece of furniture to be moved once the house was sold. The granny flat, the promises of being taken care of, it was all a lie. A temporary measure until I could be tided away, out of sight and out of mind. A wave of nausea and a strange, terrifying calm washed over me simultaneously. The love I had felt for my son, a vast and unconditional ocean, receded in an instant, leaving behind a barren, desolate wasteland. All the years of sacrifice, the money, the emotional energy, the endless giving, it had all led to this. To being a problem to be managed. When Mark's voice came back on the line, cheerful and oblivious, "Sorry about that, Mom. Now, what did you want to talk about?" I heard myself answer in a voice I didn't recognize. It was cool, steady, and devoid of all emotion. "It's nothing, son. I was just calling to say I'm still thinking about your offer. It's a big decision, you know. I'll call you next week." I hung up the phone before he could reply. I placed the receiver back in its cradle with a quiet, deliberate click. The sound echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. The weeping, grieving mother was gone. In her place stood someone new. Someone cold, clear-eyed, and utterly resolute. The grief did not come in tears. It came as a profound, chilling clarity. For days, I had been paralyzed by sadness and fear. Now, I was propelled by a cold, hard rage. It wasn't a hot, fleeting anger, but a deep, glacial fury, immense and slow-moving and unstoppable. I walked into the study and stood before the large, framed portrait of Richard that hung above the fireplace. He looked out from the canvas with his kind, steady eyes. I looked into them and I knew, with absolute certainty, what I had to do. This ranch wasn't just my home, it was his legacy. And I would not allow it to be desecrated by the greed of his own son and the woman who had corrupted him. I would not allow our life's work to be turned into a monument to their avarice. My first call was not to a lawyer. It was to Frank. I asked him to come over, and when he arrived, I told him everything. I repeated, word for word, what I had overheard on the phone. I watched his weathered face darken, his jaw clench. He didn't offer platitudes or easy comfort. He slammed his hand down on the kitchen table, making the salt and pepper shakers jump. "That does it," he growled. "That just does it." Richard would be spinning in his grave. He looked at me, his eyes full of a righteous anger that mirrored my own. "What are you going to do, Eleanor?" "I'm going to sell it," I said, the words feeling powerful and true on my tongue. All of it, a slow smile spread across Frank's face. "Good for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Good for you. It's what he would have wanted. For you to be safe. For you to be free." His validation was the final piece of armor I needed. The next morning, I drove into town. I didn't go to the family lawyer we had used for decades. I knew his loyalties would be complicated. Instead, I went to a sharp, no-nonsense attorney a town over, a woman known for her tenacity in real estate law. I laid out the situation, omitting the emotional details and sticking to the facts. I wanted to sell the property, and I wanted the sale to be ironclad and swift. I wanted to protect the proceeds in such a way that they could not be touched by my son or his wife. She listened intently, her expression unreadable. When I was finished, she simply said, "We can do that next." I contacted a commercial real estate firm, one that specialized in large land acquisitions. I knew of a particular developer, a rival to the one Mark and Amelia had courted, who was known for creating high-end, low-impact conservation communities. It was a long shot, but I presented them with the opportunity. I wasn't just selling land, I was selling a story, a legacy. I stipulated my conditions clearly. A significant portion of the land, the pristine riverfront acreage Richard had cherished, was to be placed in a permanent conservation easement, named in his honor. The main house and barn were to be preserved and restored, not gutted. I was negotiating not from a place of desperation, but from a place of power. It was my asset, and I would dictate the terms of its future. To my surprise, they were intrigued. My conditions gave the project a unique, marketable narrative. Within a week, they had made an offer that exceeded my wildest expectations. The lawyer reviewed the contract meticulously. We created an irrevocable trust. The bulk of the money would be placed within it, managed by a neutral third party. I would receive a generous annual stipend, more than enough to live on comfortably for the rest of my days. The remainder of the trust, the principal, was to be Lily's, and Lily's alone, accessible to her on her 25th birthday. There would be nothing for Mark and Amelia. Not a single cent. The day I signed the final papers, I went home and packed a single suitcase. I walked through the house one last time, my footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. I took nothing that they had ever touched with their greed. I left the expensive furniture, the art they had encouraged me to buy, the high-end appliances. I took my clothes, my personal papers, and one small, silver-framed photograph from my bedside table, a picture of a smiling young couple, Richard and me, holding our infant son, Mark. A relic from a time before the world had tainted him. I placed it in my suitcase, closed the lid, and walked out the door, not once looking back. I drove the 2 hours to the city, the landscape of my life receding in the rearview mirror. I felt no sadness, only a grim, quiet determination. I arrived at their condominium building, a sleek tower of glass and steel that had been paid for with a piece of my soul, and was announced by the doorman. I took the elevator up to their floor, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. Amelia opened the door, a surprised but pleased look on her face. "Ellie. What a surprise. Come in." Mark appeared from the living room, a hopeful, expectant smile spreading across his face. "Mom? I'm so glad you came. Does this mean you've thought about our proposal?" They led me into their living room, a sterile white space that looked like a magazine cover. They were so sure of themselves, so confident in their eventual victory. They saw my arrival as a surrender. I stood in the center of the room, my handbag clutched in my hands. "I have made a decision about your business proposition," I said, my voice even. They leaned forward, their faces alight with anticipation. "I've decided against it." Mark's face fell. He opened his mouth to argue, to begin the well-rehearsed routine of persuasion and guilt. "But Mom, you don't understand the opportunity," but he was cut off. Not by me, but by Amelia's laughter. It wasn't a small titter this time. It was a full, throaty laugh, filled with condescension and mockery. "Oh, Ellie, darling," she said, shaking her head as if I were a foolish child. "Don't be so dramatic. You'll come around. You always do." She waved a dismissive hand at me. "Go on, then. Go back to your dusty old ranch and pout for a while. We'll get it eventually. We always do." She turned her back on me, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, expecting me to tuck my tail between my legs and scurry away. But I didn't move. I waited. The silence stretched, and she finally turned back, an irritated look on her face. "Well? Is there something else?" I met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw not the sweet, simple country woman, but the architect of her downfall. "Actually," I said, my voice as cold and hard as river stone, "I won't be going back to the ranch. Not to live, anyway. The locks will be changed tomorrow morning." The smug smile vanished from her face, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Mark stared at me, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about, Mom?" I savored the moment, the final, exquisite turning of the tables. "I'm talking about the fact that the ranch is no longer mine. I sold it. The deal closed this morning." The color drained from Mark's face. Amelia stared at me, her mouth slightly agape, the laughter frozen in her throat. "You're lying," she whispered. "You wouldn't." "Oh, but I did," I said calmly. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a single, crisp business card. I walked to their ridiculously expensive marble coffee table and placed it down with a soft click. "The new owners are a development group called Sterling Legacy Communities. This is the card for their property manager. They mentioned they would be happy to discuss renting the main house to you at market rate, at least until they begin phase 1 of construction next year. I believe they are breaking ground in the spring." I watched the comprehension dawn on Amelia's face, a slow-motion horror story playing out in her eyes. I continued, my voice relentless and factual. "The proceeds from the sale have been placed into an irrevocable trust. A significant portion is for my own care and living expenses for the rest of my life. The remainder, the principal, belongs entirely to Lily, and she will gain access to it on her 25th birthday. My lawyer assured me the trust is airtight. There is nothing left for either of you." Mark sank onto the sofa, as if his legs had given out. He just stared at the floor, his face a mask of disbelief. "But Amelia..." Amelia's face contorted. The mask of sophistication shattered, revealing the raw, ugly greed beneath. Her eyes widened, her chest began to heave. She took a staggering step back, her hand flying to her throat. A choked, guttural sound escaped her lips. And then, with all the drama she so adored but none of the elegance, she collapsed. Her knees buckled and she crumpled to the plush white rug in a dead faint. Mark just stared at her, then at me, his eyes pleading, uncomprehending. I looked at the scene, my son, broken, his wife, unconscious on the floor of the life I had paid for, and I felt nothing. No pity. No regret. Only a vast, empty peace. I turned, walked out the door, and didn't look back. The laughter had finally, blessedly, stopped. My new life began with the scent of salt and the sound of gulls. I bought a small house, a lovely cottage with a wide porch and a view of the ocean, in a quiet coastal town a few hours away. Frank, true to his word, had sold his own ranch shortly after I sold mine. He said the place felt too empty without Richard and me next door, and bought a place just down the road. My new home was the antithesis of the ranch. It was small, manageable, filled with light. There were no ghosts here, no echoes of betrayal. Every object was chosen by me, for me. The furniture was comfortable, not impressive. The art on the walls was of seascapes and shorebirds, not of ancestors judging my decisions. For the first few months, I did very little. I walked on the beach. I read books. I sat on my porch with Frank, drinking coffee and watching the tides roll in and out. I was healing. The weight I had carried for years, the weight of expectation, of responsibility, of a legacy that had become a prison, was gone. I felt light. I felt free. I didn't have to answer to anyone. My time, my resources, my life, they were finally my own. I heard about the fallout, of course, through Frank, who heard it from old neighbors. Mark and Amelia's world had imploded. Their entire lifestyle, their social standing, their projected future, had been built on the assumption of my eventual demise and their subsequent inheritance. Without the ranch as collateral and my money as their personal slush fund, their tower of debt came crashing down. They had to sell the condo. They had to pull Lily from her expensive private school. Amelia, I was told, had a complete nervous breakdown. They tried to contest the sale, to challenge the trust. But my lawyer had been thorough. Their attempts were futile, serving only to drain what little money they had left. I felt a grim satisfaction at this news, but it was a fleeting, hollow feeling. My actions had not been about punishing them, not really. They had been about saving myself. The true test came about a year later. A car I didn't recognize pulled up in front of my cottage. Mark got out. He looked older, thinner. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by a deep-set weariness. He was alone. He walked up to my porch and stood at the bottom of the steps, not daring to come further. "Mom," he said, his voice quiet, hoarse. I didn't invite him in. I just stood there, waiting. I'm not here to ask for anything," he said, his eyes on the weathered wood of the porch floor. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I know it's not enough. I know I destroyed everything. But I am sorry. I was a fool. I let myself, he trailed off, unable to finish. I saw in him then a flicker of the boy he had once been, a lost soul drowning in the consequences of his own weakness. My heart, which I had thought was permanently frozen over, felt a tiny, painful thaw. But the real reason for his visit was in the passenger seat of the car. The door opened, and Lily got out. She was older now, almost a young lady. She looked at me with my own blue eyes, and her face broke into a hesitant, hopeful smile. "Grandma Ellie," she said, her voice a little shy. That was it. That was the moment. The anger, the resentment, the cold vindication, it all just washed away into the sea air. Mark and Amelia were a lost cause, a chapter one had closed. But Lily was the future. She was the innocent in all of this. She ran up the steps and threw her arms around my waist, and I hugged her back, burying my face in her hair. It was a tentative beginning. Mark started bringing her to visit once a month. The visits were awkward at first. He and I would make stilted small talk while Lily explored the beach. But slowly, a new kind of relationship began to form. One not based on financial transactions or filial duty, but on a shared, quiet love for this beautiful child who connected us. I am sitting on my porch now, a warm mug of tea in my hands. Frank is in the garden, tending to my roses. Lily is coming this weekend. She wants me to teach her how to bake the cookies that her mother once scorned. The past still exists. The scars are still there. But they no longer define me. Selling the ranch was the hardest and best thing I have ever done. I didn't lose a home. I reclaimed my life. I learned that true wealth isn't in land or money, but in self-respect. And true legacy isn't what you leave to people, but what you build inside yourself. The silence in this house is a comfort. It's a silence filled with the gentle rhythm of the waves, the promise of a peaceful future, and the quiet, triumphant sound of my own breathing.